Chris, the stage is yours. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Mark. And with a greeting such as that, I'm struggling how to open this to such an eclectic global audience. And thank you all for investing the time in the next hour or so. And thanks to Herman Miller for hosting what I hope will be a provocative food for thought 40 minutes, followed by some difficult questions, which I'm sure Mark will engineer out of this marvelous audience. So let's just see where we want to get going. So I think we're living through something like we've never seen before. This is not a market downtown. Nobody really imagined that such a crisis was possible in the 21st century. And for us, which we're a very broad church here this morning, and I'll do my best to be as succinct and as clear to the audience and to avoid jargon. And for my English friends, I will do my best to pronounce my THs properly. But we're going through what the historians will write about this period as a period of systemic change. We've hit a major inflection point in so many areas, not only in just how we think about the stuff that we're all interested in, but a whole raft of other aspects. And one of the ways I've come up with trying to help people to understand this is I think we're in a massive shift from fixed to fluid. But we're also, I think, really refocusing on greater emphasis on the human rather than the building. The office is not dead, but its purpose is fundamentally changing. And hopefully over the next 40 minutes or so, I want to take you on a bit of a journey. I hope I can provoke some fresh thinking. What I say may not go down well with some people, but hopefully, given that a lot of you are involved in the world of design, it will encourage you to think afresh. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are certainly going through something very different. And I think we're really, from an architect design point of view, we really are looking for fresh perspectives. But we have to think about this outside of our own silos, and we have to create awareness and join some of the dots from what is a very interconnected world nowadays. But most of all, we need to apply and find and identify fresh thinking. And we need to provoke people to take action rather than talk about it, to explore new dimensions and to truly innovate. Because we really need to understand all of this. And many of you have had a training in the world of design and architecture. You will remember those early days when the first thing you were taught was, how do we understand perspective? Well, I think we've lost our way in much of this. And because we're stuck in our silos, our comfort zones, our perceptions of the world. And I want to share with you some of the things I've learned, which forced me out of my traditional comfort zone of property and chartered surveying and whatever, and also focused me to rethink about was I suffering from tunnel vision. But before I do that, I just wanted to, as we're approaching the festive season, I want to suggest 2 books that you should look at, read and digest. And one of them is quite an old one, published in 1998, but it sold 28 copies. And for a publication of less than 100 pages, that's amazing. It's all about a maze and cheese equals happiness. And people, the participants in this, have assumed or taken for granted that the cheese will always be there. But one day, the cheese is gone. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the story for you, but I think it really is a good story for most of us involved in the built environment to have a look at if you haven't seen it already. Because for the property world, in researching my book and talking to over 200 or 300 people, one of the key things I discovered was that those of us involved in the built environment, whether it be design, construction, procurement, facilities, real estate, whatever, the public at large don't have a good perception of us. In fact, in Britain last year, 73% of people surveyed had a negative view of the real estate world. So that's not great. But so therefore, we need to think about this afresh. But the other thing, as I was saying earlier, that as everything is connected, the other book I would suggest you read is a recent publication by Gary Hamel, who talks about the shift to a much more human-centric world and possibly the demise of that horrible word called bureaucracy. So food for thought. But if you look at my story, I started in the world of very traditional British chartered surveying and had the good fortune of spending 13 years in a major brand, JLW, that was now JLL. And I thought it was going to be my career for life until the mid-90s. I had one of those strange calls and my life changed. I got rid of all my pinstripe suits and found I needed to wear chinos. But also I went into the world of media and broadcasting and a major US corporate and a big brand. And it really opened my eyes to a very, very different world. And then just in 2003-04, I shifted again in that I had another marvelous offer from a public service organization. Many people said to me when I announced my move from Disney to the BBC that I was going to an on-job. Little did I realize that that couldn't have been further from the truth. But by looking at all of those three marvelous organizations who I had the good fortune to work with, I've seen both sides of the coin, service provider and client, public and private sector. But also to keep myself sane, I guess, but also to learn. I've always been interested in learning. I found the world of being a non-exec director and joined the boards of some marvelous organizations over the last 20 years, which gave me yet another different perspective, how people at board level think about business, but also about our world of property, facilities and the design. So all of this, I suppose, has, I would say, equipped me to look at things differently. And I do have different views to mainstream real estate and whatever. So I want to take you through how I formed some of those. Because particularly at the BBC, which was a maelstrom of change, but Disney also was learning how to cope to be a major multinational in the mid-90s. So learning about change, but also that equipped me to see how our industry, real estate, design, construction, is probably one of the last sectors of the economy to face major disruption. And I think that's what we're looking at now. But also I want to talk more about a major shift from our focus on being consolidated and centralized to one which is more distributed, much more fluid, and the emerging agenda of a social conscience in the form of ESG and social value. But let me show you how I picked up all of this. And basically, the narrative of the BBC was at the turn of the century, it realized that although it had been a very dominant player, it had been the only game in town for years, it had very little competition. It realized at the beginning of this century that the world of broadcasting was changing and changing very quickly. So its dominance was disappearing right in front of its eyes at an alarming speed. Its cheese was dissipating very quickly, and few people saw that, and quite a lot of other people stuck their head in the sand and said, no, it'll be fine with the British Broadcasting Corporation. But digital not only changed the game for the BBC, but the stadium, given the arrival of new competition, new ways of consuming content, and new content. It was a huge dilemma for them. And it was a major challenge. And by good fortune, that's what aligned with the fact that it needed to upgrade its estate. And rather than talking about its 4 mega projects, which along with 16 other projects we got to play with over a decade, we reduced the portfolio by 40%. But what's not really recognized that the remaining 60% was completely upgraded and changed. But of the 4 big projects, I just want to highlight 4 things. Pacific Quay in 2007 was the first time the BBC went completely open plan, and that required the leadership of BBC Scotland, Ken McCorley, to actually physically move into open plan and show the way. It was also a place which was the first ever digital end-to-end production broadcasting site in the world, and that gave rise to huge operational change. The currency of broadcasting up to then was a digital tape. Now it all was digitized. So it was a remarkable shift. But also the other aspect which informed some of my views for later was this idea of moving from downtown to the other side of the Clyde, the other side of the railway tracks, to help as a public body to pump prime regeneration. So it was a huge insight. Broadcasting House was the £1 billion project which attracted huge interest because it was so expensive. But in reality, it was a very cost-effective solution in that the building will last for 100 years. It'll be a building not only for the BBC, but for London and for Britain as a cultural icon. But the most important thing was that we recognised that it wasn't about the design or the construction. They were secondary to creating somewhere where great journalism could take place 24/7. And then that gave rise to the need to equalise the BBC's service of its audiences, its customers across Britain, and the shift from an 80-20 focus on having everything coming from London to a 50-50, a more equal and equitable split of the audience fee income. And that gave rise to creating what it was called a new city at Salford. But what people realised was that in order to move to a new greenfield site, Mark Thompson, the CEO of the BBC at the time, said we also needed to create a greenfield organisation. So how programmes are made in Salford, how the teams are managed, it was all completely different to how things went on in London. And it, I suppose, then gave him some great insights as he moved on to use the exact same methodology to help reshape the New York Times, which he successfully did when he left the BBC. And then Television Centre, an icon of the BBC. It was on the news programmes 24/7 for 20 plus years. When the difficult decision was taken to sell that, how could we sell it in a depressed market? And it gave rise to fresh thinking based not on smart property thinking, but on a product development approach. And that gave rise to the concept of land and brand. But also it gave us a great opportunity to understand what social value really means. So bottom line, all of this helped me understand that if you have a productive workplace, you will have a productive workforce. And many business leaders did not get that and view offices as just an expense line item. So that was one of the reasons underpinning why I wanted to write the book. So there were some of the things that informed my thinking about how to deal with change. And, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we are facing huge uncertainty at the moment, and many of us are trying to figure out how we stay safe, but also how do we survive in our businesses in a world which is full of uncertainty. And I want to offer you a few thoughts around all of that. But there were three questions on the slide which I've always sort of used as a pointer for me, in that you know, if you look at where we are today, all the playbooks and precedents all of us have relied upon for many years have gone out the window. We're in a completely new territory, and the pandemic has forced huge challenges. You know, people have suffered dreadfully, but I fear that the next year, whilst we are seeing the arrival of vaccines, the economic aspects of the pandemic have yet to be fully felt. So we need to understand all of that. But we need, as an industry, and when I say industry, I mean real estate, design, construction, anybody involved in the provision and consumption of commercial real estate, specifically offices, but it can cover them all. We really need to think about what our role is in the overall economy, how we connect, what are our connections, because sadly, for the most part, our default is being hugely introspective. So we need to ask ourselves the question, do we suffer from tunnel vision, and can we stand back and see how everything fits in? Because one of the key challenges I fear is that we're going to have difficulties come to terms with the role of place is diminishing. for real estate folk, the old adage of location, location, location may well come under challenge. It may well be diluted. And we need to see what's coming over the hill. And we need to be objective about that, because I honestly believe that the cheese has shifted. And let me show you why. And I suppose in doing all of that, the book, I guess I have to mention that, people said, how did I come up with a title, Where's My Office? And how did you get it written in time to cope with the pandemic? Well, thankfully, I had most of it written by the end of February, and I was very fortunate that living to the principle of seeing the wood for the trees, of finding a great partner in crime, a completely disconnected person with our world, Eugenia, who helped using her journalistic skills to help me tell the story so that people outside our world would have a better understanding of our world. So, because we need to make that link better, CFOs and CEOs have to realize that there are other benefits to be had from making best use of the built environment rather than treating it as an expense item and something where costs need to be minimized. Because I'm sure there's lots of people on this call who are full of good ideas and yet they're stymied. And I want to come back to that in a moment. But also, I guess, what I did learn at Disney and the BBC was to share insights and learning, because the acid test of anybody who's successful in the 21st century is their ability to collaborate and share. So I hope there are things that people will get out of the book which will be useful. Last but not least is the whole issue of, I really feel, and this is why this session is so important, I'm really grateful to Mark and Herman Miller for the opportunity to share my views. I think we need to start a real debate about making smarter use of the office. One that's more flexible, sustainable, and focused on the human aspects, not just the building and return on assets. We really need to rethink all of this, and that's why I chose the title I did, the book. Let me show you why I talk about the system, not the office. There's simply a huge disconnect. If you talk to the RICS, their view is that surveyors, property people, investors are trying to serve two masters, the investors and the occupiers. The whole thing is driven by a financing system underpinned by a landlord and tenant system, which basically is medieval in time. But the other aspect is, because of the way deals are structured, there's a huge gulf. There's no direct link between the provider and the consumer. It's all adversarial. There are very few relationships. Very few people on the supply side understand the customer journey. Are we stuck, I ask myself, in a vicious cycle? Who is our client? Will the status quo of what exists today, which is full of misunderstanding, will that prevail? Hopefully, I will have provoked you in the course of this session to think a bit differently about this, because there are some really big dilemmas around all of this. And in the book, I identified 6. I want to take you through them very quickly. The biggest and most important is that business has speeded up considerably over the last 20 years. Business cycles have reduced considerably. It's all about speed to market. One never hears of having 5 or 10-year plans anymore. It's really shocking how quickly things and at what pace things need to move at. Are we in sort of what people would call the age of acceleration? And that then is, I suppose, contrast in the landlord and tenant model, which I want to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment, where it's the only way consumers can access commercial real estate if they don't want to buy it. And the other aspect is, we are a very fragmented industry. The focus on bringing new product onto market is the world of the asset, the design, the construction, and then when it's handed over, the world of facility management takes over. Well, surely the facilities managers, the people who operate the building 24/7, should have a bigger say in how buildings get designed and specified. Maybe their day has arrived. then if you look at it from a more corporate perspective, if you ask a HR professional to describe what does the workplace means, it's somewhat different to what a CRE or an FM or a design person will see, the physical versus the human. But it's the same word, but it speaks legends. We also, I guess, have a bigger challenge in that many of us, from all sides of the coin, have a focus on overemphasizing the role of the physical, whereas we're truly now living in the world of the digital. And the last 10 months, I guess, has been a massive experiment of a shift to a much more physical world. That's clearly not sustainable in its own, but what's the blended solution that might emerge out of this? And one of the other aspects, I think, which is holding back a proper discourse of having a discussion, a meaningful discussion about how to move forward, is the fact that within the support functions of large organizations, we have a wide divergence of agendas dependent upon if we're in the world of real estate, the world of HR, or the world of technology. So they're all big challenges, and I can see a need coming from the C-suite that we need to think beyond these silos. We need to join up the dots. We need to ask ourselves big questions about physical versus virtual, because organizations such as GitLab and others seem very comfortable with working in a virtual manner. But one thing's for sure is that what most corporations will be striving for, having survived the next year or so, is how to secure competitive advantage by being the employer of choice. And that means the facilities and where they're located and how they're accessed and how they're consumed and what they cost and how they're operated. They're all going to be much more pertinent questions that people are going to be asking. But then we need to think and look at how we deliver all of this stuff. And I've always sort of tried to think about this in a structured, linear fashion. But the Churchillian quote about Soviet Russia sums the whole thing up, in that the process we have in terms of real estate, it's a riddle wrapped up in a mystery inside an enigma. And if you look at all of this, multiple handoffs, variety of stakeholders, players, duplication, who is the real customer here? Many of the people I interviewed talked about the waste of commercial office fit-outs, and how does that square away with the emergence of circular economy thinking. Actually, some property companies, take Boston Properties, for example, are asking themselves how can they create deals with less fit-outs. And as I said earlier, the gulf of misunderstanding persists, and that there's no direct relationship between the principals, the ultimate provider and the ultimate consumer. So in looking at all of this, I summed up on the back of the research that the system is very costly, very convoluted, and extremely confrontational. So the challenge to this audience is, can we do better? Can we do things differently? Who's going to be leading the way in terms of disruption? And we all are very aware of the arrival of the flex providers, but I want to give you three very quick examples who may not be regarded as the usual suspects, but I want to see, can you spot what the common denominators are amongst these three British organizations, some of which have a global reach. The Office Group, British organization, it's all about sharing, but also with great design. Started from nothing at the beginning of this. It's now a substantial business in its own right with some great clients. You take another organization which not that many people know about. They may recognize some of their brands, but Newflex is, offers flexible management contracts, but it's part of a much bigger, stronger group. And, it's an interesting business in its own right. And then on the other side of the coin, the intermediary, there's the Instant Group, which, started once again at the end of the last century and has grown to be something very substantial, went through a satisfactory buyout, and is offering new solutions and quite significant. So there are three examples of how things can do things differently. I wonder how we can do fit outs and how we can design better workplaces differently to meet the new paradigm, I ask myself. But to looking at all of that, I suppose we really need to draw all of this together, and I think we need to understand the context of where we are, because for the people interested in the office, the workplace, we have to recognize that that is a legacy of a bygone age, the industrial world, and there have been huge shifts, all of which we've been all aware of, and we've been talking about ad infinitum for the last 20 years. But very few people have actually looked at them in the round. And where is the journey of the office from its 20th century origins into where we are today, the third decade of the 21st century? We talked about the shift from analog to digital, but looking at all of the other aspects, we're certainly moving away from rows and rows of desks where people spend all their days just sitting at monitors, sending emails to one another or processing paper. Paper has virtually disappeared. Even the lawyers are now getting comfortable with working in a digital world. I'm old enough to remember the arrival of the fax machine and how wonderful that was in the late 80s, and it seems to have disappeared also in my lifespan. That's freaky, or the disappearance of fixed phones and desks. So we need to see all of these aspects in the round, particularly the view that we're moving from a very closed mind, or we have moved to a much more porous and much more connected. And, from a real estate investment perspective, this focus on you either buy a building or lease a building or sublease it or have it via serviced office provider who leases it from somebody else, this fixed own bit, this shift to on demand and subscribe. You look at the way software packages, we were all buying Word and Excel 5-10 years ago, and it's now all subscribed. But the other aspect which people need to understand is that the age of our focus on efficiency is diluted now to be more of a focus on effectiveness. And also, like it or not, the focus on providing a much bigger emphasis on the community, on societal aspects, the arrival of social value, that being measured by environmental, social and government criteria from investors. All of these things were happening. We were all talking about the birth of the experience-focused office. In the last 10 months, what's happened is COVID has basically thrown rocket fuel on all of this. And it's going to be irreversible, and it's really going to be challenging in terms of how we move forward. So I guess what a lot of people are noodling on at the moment is this debate about the future of the office, because directly impacts a lot of people on this call in terms of how you derive your income or your profit, or how do you advise your clients. And it's a remarkable thing that we've managed to just focus in on a very narrow aspect of it. The office isn't dead, but it's certainly not going back to normal. Because most of us on this call will be comfortable with the fact that office work in how we understand it today, you can do office work anyhow, anywhere, anytime, but also with anyone. And that gives rise to job share. But we also can't ignore the fact that AI was coming anyway, and the machine learning is rapidly improving on a day-by-day basis, and many of the processing type jobs will disappear a lot faster than we were originally thinking. So this either or office versus home, that debate is fundamentally flawed, because it's focused just on two options. We all know that there are much more options available, a much wider permutation. And that's why I talk about the fact that not only the game is changing, but the stadium, our frame of reference for how we think about the consumption, but also the provision of these facilities we call offices, is now moving to a different plane. Because enterprise will not thank us for ignoring the fact that to be successful going forward, to survive, they will need talent. And talent now have a fresh, different frame of reference for how they want to work, be they young people, middle age, old age, whatever the case may be. Everybody has used the period of the last 10 months to reflect and discover new opportunities. So working at home for most people is not viable on a long-term continuous basis. But what are the other options? And I think the system is holding us back in terms of we're being forced into an either-or debate, whereas we need to think broader. And that's why my challenge to people here with a design background is, so what could something better, something new really look like? And let me just throw a few ideas in terms of to get you thinking. But I think the world of work has really shifted to a much more fluid, some call it hybrid, some call it blended. I go back, I guess, to the roots of being able to work any place, anywhere, anytime. And, you know, we talked about in the book omni-channel marketing and omni-working. Because really, are we looking at a position where we're seeing the individual as the workplace? That's a food for thought, because all of those traditional, you know, shifting paper, going to team meetings so managers could check up on you, all of that has been brought into question. And that's why I urge you to have a look at what Gary Hamel has written about the stupidity of the bureaucracy of how some organizations continue to operate themselves. Is that a sustainable business strategy for the future? But the other aspect this, I think, has caused me pause for thought is that by being able to offer people the opportunity to work in a different range of settings, does that open opportunities to broaden the diversity of organization, to offer people who may not be able to get to work, people who don't have all their abilities, a new opportunity? Does it open up social mobility? One area it does open up is parents, the working dad or mum who've had to make difficult choices in the past because they only had one way of working. And, you know, it's not that long ago when many organizations frowned on mothers making the natural choice to become a mother, and their career prospects were severely dented. Could we be seeing new opportunities here? So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing a shift away from centralized and consolidated thinking or focus to a much more distributed way of thinking, one based on a network. Maybe, you know, even we can think about the ecosystem. So if you draw all of that together in the context of a sort of a fixed to fluid mindset, I think we have to look at a situation where many organizations, not everybody, and that's the issue, and that the big shift is we're going to have to get our head around trying to apply a one-size-fits-all mentality to these solutions, because it won't work. Organizations will be thinking about distributed workforces, not only because CFOs are eyeing the opportunity to reduce costs, but for a much more important reason, one of resilience. Dreadful to say, but most risk managers are talking about, what if there's another COVID, a COVID-20? Are we going to have to survive through pandemic times, which won't be 1 or 2 years, which could be a lot longer? But also, along with the other societal issues which have been happening anyway, are we seeing a fundamental rethink about office work so that we forgo the legacy of the industrial age of 9 to 5? And that's all driven by the employer of choice. So if you look at that on the left-hand side in terms of how businesses are looking, if you look at our system of how we provide space, you know, historically, consumption of space was restricted to you bought a building, you leased the building, or you subleased it. And then home working started to evolve, and third space started to come along. And then the explosion of the flex sector, you know, driven by many people. Don't forget that it wasn't WeWork who were the kings of the castle for service provision. Mark Dixon and Regis and many other players you know, were pioneering this 20 years ago, but they were a small aspect of the overall choice of how a consumer could access the office building. You know, it was less than 5% of the overall market. Some people are forecasting that'll grow to 30% of the total spectrum of choice. I think it'll grow to 50%, and it'll be underpinned by a massive regrading of how we offer service, from being a narrow, here's a building, take it, here's the rent and you pay service charge, to a much greater focus on space as a service. And I think you'll see a much greater blending of portfolios. Maybe even some property companies will be offering their customers, not their tenants, the ability to think about their property portfolio as a platform rather than as an estate. So whilst there are challenges for many people who wish to stay in a traditional mindset, I can also see huge opportunity on a whole range of this. And necessity being the mother of all invention, the challenge for people on this conversation is to say, what could we do differently? And I think that really sort of brings me almost to the end of my discourse. I want to talk a little bit about three things. You know, the idea that we're anchored in, you know, what is the physicality of it? The design of the interior, the design of the building, the nature of the building itself, the asset. How can I get a return of that? Don't forget that there's no value from any of this unless somebody, namely an organization, a consumer, agrees to be a tenant. And given that we were all living with the underutilization of most buildings, in that, you know, since DGW first let the genie out of the bottle, that space was only being used 40-50% of its useful life. You know, we've been living almost a bit like a case of the emperor's new clothes. COVID-19, ladies and gentlemen, has swept that away, and we need to find a different way of justifying the role of space, as Frank Duffy said, in a virtual world. But we also need to, you know, employ our great inventiveness to rethink the nature of the workplace. These buildings in the city centres are not going to be empty. They just need to be reimagined. We really need to rethink. We need to think about different uses over different time spans. Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 is under complete attack, and rightfully so. You know, if you look at all of these buildings, why can't they be used in a much more intensive manner, in a smarter manner? So the challenge to the design community is, what can we do to create a new paradigm there? Because we can't ignore the fact that ubiquitous choice is here to stay. And WeWork and their marvelous billion-dollar marketing campaign really let the cat out of the bag pre-COVID, in that people outside of our spectrum, basically business leaders, were woken up to the fact, because they read about WeWork, they read about their tremendous success, including their IPO, and learned that, hey, maybe we do have choice. Then along came COVID, and that basically decimated the principle of presenteeism, which was held dearly by many middle-level managers who wanted to keep control of their workforces by saying, I have to be able to see you sitting at your desk to reassure me that you're doing work. Well, that's also diluted. And it's been diluted not only by the CFOs saying we can be much more efficient and effective, but by the workforce voting with their feet saying, I want to work differently. And this is not just something which is a Western European thing. It's North America has been mulling on this for years before this, and the penny has dropped over. Why are we wasting so much time commuting? I know there's a variety of different issues around in terms of, you know, Asia Pacific, and I know there's some people off from Australia, and I know that the nature of your cities are slightly different, and that's why it's really important to remember that one size fits all thinking doesn't apply. Everybody is going to be different, but there are some broad principles then they can be adopted to individual regions of the world, individual cultures. And you have to understand all of this. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, my call to action is that we need to apply fresh thinking. We need to look at how we provide and consume these buildings of that we call offices. We need to think about this in terms of not only the economic side of things, but the sustainability and the climate change, because we need to get serious about all of this. And I guess I would close on that by saying, we're all aware of the fact that the reality is that commercial buildings account for 45% of greenhouse gas emissions. Much of our construction process, particularly fit outs, it's wasteful. Is it time, ladies and gentlemen, to call a halt? I think we are in the last chance saloon. We have got to put things right now, not kicking the can down to 2030 or 2050. All of us have a duty of care to not only ourselves, but to the generations that follow us, to rethink and reimagine our approach to how we use our precious planet. We, ladies and gentlemen, are stewards of the built environment. Make no mistake about that. We need to look into our hearts and ask ourselves, what can I do to make a difference? Start with asking why. Let's make a start with how we reshape the world of office work. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much. If you could stop sharing your screen, that would be really good so that we can see you. Huge amount of interaction that's been going on in the chat box, and thank you very much everyone that's done that. But there are a few questions that have come in for you, Chris. Someone's asked, they'd like to know what you have seen in terms of operational processes in business. From what they've seen this year across multiple sectors, it's exposed the lack of joined up processes, especially in the legal sector.
Yeah. Wow, that's a very broad-reaching question. You're keeping true to your promise, Mark, of providing interesting challenges. I guess what I would start with is culture, in that every sector has its own culture, and you take the culture of the legal profession, where for many decades it was premised upon a partner and a couple of juniors sitting close by so they could soak up the learning of the world of legal. So that and I'm assuming the questioner, when they talk about operational, they mean sort of the management or the operation of business as opposed to the operation of the facility. I came across a very interesting example of a small 40-50 person legal practice in Ireland, where they were talking about not being able to go into the office but using a satellite office. And I asked the senior partner, how was that faring? And he said he was shocked, because he realized that they could effect legal transactions by using digital signatures. But more importantly, he said the juniors who had just come in as graduates had realized that they weren't getting this social interaction. But they said, well, we can figure something out to keep us going for the time being using Teams, and we'll manage. And I think that's one of the big challenges, is that a lot of us are opining on stuff without asking the 20 and 30-year-olds what their opinion is. If you look at it, they are all digital natives. They're much more comfortable with the world where digital is in the primacy, as opposed to those like you and I, Mark, who have a few miles in the clock, and we're still struggling with the transition from paper to digital. But also on how people, the fear of the boss, the inability to share, very prevalent in the real estate world, probably in design as well, in the context of this is my design, I own it. Whereas today, the value accretor is one of the ability to share, collaborate and curate, not holding on to information.
Thank you. How do we support psychological, have I got my audio on? Yes, I have. How do we support psychological safety in the transition from a 20th century to 21st century workplace? How might organizations help to contain those genuine stresses which accompany the fluid, the porous, and the electronic in our working life?
Basically, managers have got to up their game. And secondly, we need both designers and operators, and everybody needs to really get their heads around well-being. And I've tried to learn a lot about not only the physical but the emotional aspects of well-being. And talking to my friend Amanda, who talks about the wellness and the flourishing index, around how do we actually are proactive in supporting people as they try to figure out how to work differently. And, let me give you two examples of how we're getting it wrong. Our use of language. People have heard me in the past talk about that dreadful, inappropriate phrase called hot desking. Well, let me give you another one. Remote working. What does remote working mean, ladies and gentlemen? It almost implies that the individual remote worker has been ostracized away from the gang, the pack. How do they feel? And another behavioral psychologist of mine said to me, we really need to think about our vernacular here and our use of language, and also then provide active support to help people figure out how to work differently. And I tried to say earlier that, distributed working doesn't mean working from home completely. I think you're going to see the arrival of a lot more localized work hubs, which will give people the variety of choice to work closer to home, along with hub and spoke and all the other variables. And I think that's going to give a much greater richness, which will enable people to interact, because fundamentally we are social animals. But management has to move into the 21st century.
Thank you, Chris. How do we avoid a divide between those who can work in different places and those who have to be present, i.e. the facilities team? It's difficult maintaining an organizational culture, and often the lowest paid that don't get the benefits of flexible working.
Great question, and it reminds me, and I apologize, that one of the things I meant to say at the outset was that, one of the tripwires of focusing on office work is we just focus on the people who do office work. One of the labels is white collar workers, which doesn't really apply. But to do all of that, they require a complete support ecosystem, facility management being just one of many aspects. And you're right that how they are supported, given that they have to go in, I think gives the facilities management industry and the people who are their clients a real cause for thought around how to do this better and in a safer fashion, given that we're not out of the woods yet.
Okay, thank you. One more. After having 100% flexibility when working from home, how can people really be expected to come back to the office, even for just 2 days a week after the pandemic? Big challenge.
Huge. It all depends on the nature of the organization, where the organization is in its life cycle, its maturity, the nature of its leadership and its management tier. The world of HR and whatever best label that goes with them in the future, it's going to be hugely challenging to provide the support to say, what are my options? Because, as I said before, we're coming out of a 20th century where standardization was the order of the day. And many of us will remember being just an employee number. I think we're heading into the age of the human now, where demands like these, which are reasonable. If you look at, the Gallup polls of how office workers have engaged or not engaged with their organizations pre-COVID, this was coming anyway. So COVID has just basically put the cat amongst the pigeons.
Great, thank you. If you don't mind, I've got a couple more questions. We'll keep going, if that's okay with you, Chris.
Sure.
I understand the role of the designer, but what about the role of the quantity surveyor or the project manager? How do they help to redefine value rather than just pounds and pence or euros for some of those, and dollars?
Or dollars. Yeah.
Or dollars.
Well, I think to start with, understand who the ultimate customer is. I think, as I said to the RICS last week, it's time to realize that their cheese has moved. And, you know, it is a great profession, needs to understand it's now very much in the 21st century, that it's not just about driving costs. It's about working with the world of design to come up with great designs rather than penny pinching ones. I think we're moving from the world of efficiency to one of effectiveness. And underpinning all of this, and we didn't have time to look at it in any detail this morning, was the shift away from focusing on shareholder value to stakeholder value. Make no mistake, that's happening.
Thank you. In fact, it's interesting actually that someone commented that actually Disney should get involved with this, because they're the kings of being the experience, and as workplace becomes more of an experience, they could probably do a good job there. I have another question for you. How do you imagine the changes to the culture of one company, since their employees will have to work in this ubiquitous way? I guess the cultural challenges.
Well, I think if you look at the nature of the question, since their employees have to, I think you will see that many employees, take the example of the British Prime Minister ordering the British Civil Service back to work in September. For those based in Britain, you will remember the response, which was no. And I think we're seeing that Maslow's hierarchy has been revisited. Many workers are now saying, I know I have to earn money to pay the mortgage, but I also have to take into account the risk to me and my family if I happen to be infected by this dreadful disease. So that fear factor is a completely new component to this. But also, because we've had an unprecedented period of time to really reflect, for the first time probably since ancient Roman times or the Renaissance, that everybody in the world has had a chance to stand back and see the wood for the trees and to say, what am I really doing? Is it worth my while to get on a train which is crowded and be like sardines to go into an office just to send emails?
Chris, thank you very much for an outstanding overview of where we are at the moment and where we might going to need to move to in the future.